Thanks, Jason. My name's Kate Goodwin. I'm a member of the Tin Sheds Advisory Board, adjunct professor at the University of Sydney Architecture Department, and also an independent curator working across arts and spatial practice. And I would like to begin by acknowledging that I am coming to you, the lands of the Gadi people, which is also the site of the Tin Sheds Gallery. And I would like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging who have been the custodians of these incredible lands, seas, skies, and waters for time memoriam. And to take a moment to remember that these are unceded lands and that sovereignty was never ceded. On behalf of the Tin Sheds team, I would like to welcome you all to this talk, artist talk, to accompany the exhibition Actions for Water. It's being curated by the brilliant Sharmila Wood, who is going to host today's talk. Sharmila's work crosses across social change, history, and ecology. And as I think you will see from the exhibition, that work, it's around research, writing, design, and communication. And as well as a curator, she's also director of Tararuru, which is a consultancy sort of creative studio that works upon requests from Aboriginal communities and organisations. She'll be joined by one of the fabulous artists within her show, Daniel Jan Martin, who is an environmental planner and designer working on Noongar Country. He's a lecturer in landscape architecture at the University of Western Australia, an independent consultant and co-lead of the environmental practice Supernatural. And his work crosses across geospatial analysis, environmental planning, communication and strategy, and really think around how ecological systems connect with urban design. And this is a fabulous exhibition for us, and particularly this talk at the Tin Sheds Gallery, because what we intend to do is to provide a space and a platform to come together to have really critical conversations around the issues that we face in life and the built environment. That's that kind of intersection between the social, political, environmental and cultural issues. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation when we can further interrogate those ideas and think about how creativity opens up how we think about the world. A couple of housekeeping things. Today's lecture is being recorded. Please keep your cameras on if you would like, or turn them off as you see fit. We're going to have about 45 minutes and hopefully a little bit of time at the end for some questions, which Sharmila will host. But I will hand over to Sharmila to speak for a moment about the exhibition, and Daniel. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you to the Tin Sheds Gallery for presenting Actions for Water. It's wonderful to expand the exhibition through these conversations, and I really value the partnership with the University of Sydney School of Architecture, Design and Planning in creating this space. A special thanks to Jason Oakey and Yakov and Paradis for their contributions to helping to facilitate this series of artist talks. I'm speaking to you today from Wajak Noongar Budja, and I pay my respects to traditional owners of this land and to Indigenous people across Australia. My own thinking has been deeply shaped by Indigenous leadership, particularly through time spent in the northwest of Western Australia. And I want to acknowledge the work of Professor Anne Polina, an advocate for multi-species justice, whose writings have influenced how I understand land, water and rivers as living beings with their own agency and rights. That understanding, the sense that systems we often overlook hold deep meaning and value, is something I see echoed in the work of Daniel Martin. I admire Daniel's practice for his drive to communicate and visualise, to bring together the language of mapping, environmental planning, intercultural agency and future thinking with a resonant storytelling approach that creates tools for advocacy and design, especially when it comes to the often invisible infrastructures of aquifers, wetlands and urban water flows. Daniel's work was introduced to me by the Noongar elder, Dr. Noel Nana, and I want to acknowledge this intersection and the immense generosity of traditional owners in Western Australia and across the country. I'm happy to now hand over to Daniel for his presentation and thank him in advance for his contributions to Actions for Water.
Thank you so much, Sharmila, and thank you, Kate, and the University of Sydney Tin Sheds for hosting the exhibition. Noel Noel Nanup has been a wonderful collaborator of both Sharmila's and mine, and is a fantastic Noongar elder. And I'd like to start also by acknowledging the Noongar people, the lands I'm sitting on today, but also the lands that have informed so much of this work in Perth and the southwest of Australia. And it is sort of a local presentation. My place is the southwest of WA, and yeah, there's a bit of, I think, relevance and resonance with other places, and I've tried to bring a little bit of resonance from Sydney in today. But I've called this Actions for Water, Resistance is Fertile, and that little yeah, those words, resistance is fertile, that was actually the Greater Sydney Commissioner, Rod Simpson. I attended a conference at Daruban on the Hawkesbury River back in, I think, 2011, and heard Rod Simpson speak and just thought, the city can be a site for design thinking and for sort of fertile thinking. So resistance is fertile is a little nod to Rod Simpson's talk back in 2011. Yeah, I also want to acknowledge another great and sadly past mentor and teacher of mine, Richard Weller. The work I'm doing in Perth is very much indebted to the work Richard began in the 90s here, and beginning the landscape course at UWA. And yeah, he sadly passed away about a month ago. So the sort of the weight of a wonderful teacher like this lives on in so many of our ways of thinking and working, and that's certainly true for this work. And in the last year, Richard had spent time, as he did through his whole career, thinking about the relationship of nature and culture. And he'd done this whole series of 75 small paintings of these relationships all over the world, and many of the places he'd worked. But yeah, that's just an acknowledgement to Richard, and really leads me to this Hotspot Cities project. In the southwest of WA, we're in a hotspot, a biodiversity hotspot, as Sydney is, and the sort of east coast of Australia. But these are really important regions globally where it's a great thing that there's immense biodiversity, but they're hotspots because that biodiversity is in conflict with escalating human impacts, whether they're mining or resource extraction, or in the case of Perth in the southwest, urbanisation, agriculture, and certainly mining as well. So this symposium that was hosted in 2018 was a fantastic coming together of many practitioners from ecology and urban design and landscape architecture and architecture planning from across the world in these hotspot cities to kind of talk about ways of resistance, ways of building cultivating a new way forward with ecology at the center of how we can build and how we can think, and water, which is inextricably linked, as I'll kind of mention. But very inspiring to see all cities, Cape Town, Shenzhen, Mexico City, all with their own projects, all with these wonderful actions flourishing. And on the right there, the Greater Sydney Green Grid, which was actually also presented by Rod at that symposium. So the Hotspot Cities project sort of takes us into the southwest of WA here, and that figure there, 9,100, it's a quantum of a wondrous environment. It's the quantum of the number of native flora species in the southwest. And what sounds like initially an abstract number kind of gets put into perspective when you think the whole of Europe has about 10,600 native floral species. So, that entire geography sort of condensed into this incredible richness, which is in that one of the most ancient corners of the world, Australia and the world, in the southwest of WA. And I think looking at this through the lens of science, and scientists Stephen Hopper and Paul Goya have done a study here around where the endemism is located, the propensity for these species to occur here and nowhere else, and then the richness as well, the species richness. And what becomes really evident here is that Perth lights up the map of the southwest. So Perth as a city is really sort of a hotspot within the hotspot of the southwest. 2,052 species. Half of these are endemic, which is astonishing, only found in this region. 34% of conservation concern. And, you know, there's going to be a lot of sort of more abstract mappings and other ways of re-seeing, but kind of the richness of some of this flora and the species, the birds and the bird life and the interaction of ecology in the southwest is really a sight to behold. And yeah, it's certainly coming through in a lot of the work in Actions for Water as well, particularly the Underfoot Collective and their kind of immersion in this southwest biodiversity hotspot. So, I mean, I'm going to attempt something really radical here, which is to connect the word wonder, which is, you know, what we might think of as something to behold, something to be uncertain about, but something to also marvel in, with a concept of planning, which often isn't associated with an idea about wonder. But some words here from Noel Nannup. A capacity for wonder is innate. Wonder is a foundation gift we're all given to help us connect with the world and care for everything in it. I love this idea that wonder is a gift. And, you know, I think we often embrace this very much as children, and perhaps we lose this as the complexities of things that are less wondrous in the world take hold. But to immerse in the southwest and the incredible ecosystems that it offers, and particularly Perth, has been a space of wonder in my own journey as a design practitioner and as a landscape architect, and as a landscape architect always frustrated by small scales and wanting to scale up and think about the bigger scales of the city, from the ancient landscapes to the river systems to the dunal landscapes along the coasts of Perth, starting to think about this land as wondrous. To bring up another kind of theory here of objects and fields, this is a tension that I'm always thinking about in planning and in my work. The idea of an object versus the idea of a field, and that when something becomes a field, it functions in a whole new way. It is an assemblage of many objects, but it takes on a new function. It takes on a new way of operating. And this kind of idea was one that I read about in landscape theory early in my studies, and sort of became fascinated with. To think then about planning. I mean, this is a planning map for Perth now, and we find here, I think, more than many other spaces, a real embeddedness of old ways of thinking that might have seemed appropriate in the 1940s or the 1950s, that became embedded in maps in the 1960s and 70s, and have been really hard to shake away as a city and as a place. And, you know, these kinds of zoning maps, they're common throughout cities, like particularly Australian cities. But to kind of critique that idea of boundedness, to critique the idea of boundaries. And this has a lot to do with ecosystems, and it has a lot to do with water, and it has a lot to do with things that flow. So this is an image of the sort of bleeding edge of Perth's urban sprawl, and that idea of a biodiversity hotspot kind of on show. You've got incredible ancient Banksia woodland with a surface crust in the landscape which could be 1,000 years old, right alongside imported sand pads and a very brutal form of housing. So housing is a theme that I'll keep coming back to in this short talk, because to ignore housing as an imperative for our society and just talk about landscape also isn't helpful. That these things have to come into they obviously do come into friction, but they need to come into dialogue and into harmony. So just another sort of depressing image of a Banksia woodland north of Perth, and nearby that photograph. Over time, you can just sort of see a whole landscape shift here, and you take it back to a planning map, and you start to understand that the boundaries that get drawn and the ways that planning sees the landscape becomes the reality. And I would argue it's a sort of objectification of that. It's turning something that is a flow into an object, that is a field into an object. So these are some future projected urban zones around the edges of Perth sprawl. To go back to Rod Simpson, Environment Commissioner in Sydney from 2016 to 2020. He said, these plans become reality, so we need to shift our plans. And it's like an obvious sort of statement, but the importance of representation, I think, can't be, we can't sort of emphasize that enough. The way we draw and the way we think, the way that our landscape is formulated into representations like planning maps is so important in driving the outcomes in the land. And Rod also says we need an environmental plan with a radical shift in thinking underpinned by landscape, underpinned by ethos. So the idea of actions for water certainly grows out of this idea for me of reseeing, of going back to those representations and speaking to elders like Noel and others like Elder Sandra Harben to think about how our landscape can be reseen, what other stories can be told. And particularly, although it's another form of mapping, what maps can be created that start to challenge and question the legitimacy of something like a metropolitan region scheme, a planning map that purports to know and create all land around Perth. So this was a bit of an impetus behind this Whole Perth Catalogue that's on display at the exhibition as well. A way of sort of diving into different reseeings of a city and playing on this idea of a whole earth catalogue. Once you sort of think of it, it's impossible to resist. You've got a whole earth catalogue and then you've got a whole Perth catalogue. But, taking us in now to maps of Perth, a city which sprawls along a glorious coastline, and you arrive at that Warradan, at that ocean, and look out over the Indian Ocean, and it's, the sun sets over there, and it's just, Perth is a city on a very long beach, and a beautiful beach at that. But it's got its own challenges. It sprawls. I think it's one of the longest sprawling cities, about 158 kilometres of continuously developed coastline, which has so many challenges for the ecology that's here. Many eons of moving of sand, creating the dunes that make up Perth. Perth is a city of sand. And you come up to the edge of the city there to the east and you arrive at the Darling Escarpment, the Cardamonda, which is one of the most ancient landscapes in the world. They've found the rocks out there to date the kind of Big Bang, 4.4 billion years. So it's a whole 4.4 billion years. So it's a whole an incredible system out there on the Yilgarn. Water. This has flown through the landscape as these incredible river systems that meet the ocean, and a whole life breathing wetlands, and a history of this incredible wetland tapestries that have in many cases been filled in for urban development, but many of these wetlands still remain, and they're an incredible life force through the city. To sort of look at that biodiversity around Perth and understand that it's very much alive. I mean, it's similar to Sydney in many respects, but you don't have to go far in Perth to find a piece of ancient landscape. In Melbourne, you might have to drive many hours to find a bit of grassland that you could say is a bit of ancient land. But in Perth, you find this right through the city. And that's an amazing opportunity for a city to respect, to care for, to come to reorient itself towards. So these maps have been forming part of a way of planning and a way of framing up sites and places around Perth through an ecological and an environmental lens. And I'm going to sort of take us into a few of those studies and offer some alternative ways of thinking about housing and development in a moment. But just to look at these three maps of the aquifer systems, the superficial aquifer, the very surface level aquifer, which is this huge mountain of water beneath the city. And for many, many years, Perth has used this for irrigation and for its water supply. But where this mountain of water crosses the surface is the formation of wetlands. So all the wetlands form where this mountain of water crosses. And you can kind of look beneath the city and start getting transfixed by these geo-soundings, which go even deeper. 500 meters beneath the city, the mid-tier aquifer, which contains many, many hundreds of cubic kilometres of water. And then even deeper, the Yarragadee, the deepest aquifer, which is 15 kilometres below the city in some places. And here the water is, 95 degrees Celsius, 40,000 years old. And there's 2,000 Sydney harbours of water beneath the city in this deepest aquifer. And, this is sort of, I think it's a really interesting idea in terms of actions for water, that water doesn't go away. You don't encounter water and then leave water. In a place like Perth, but indeed in really every place, water is everywhere. Water is beneath everything. Water is in everything. Water is, of course, in us. It's all around. So the idea that we might encounter and then leave water is certainly not an idea, I don't think, of the future. The idea that water is everywhere and that we're acting for water everywhere is, I think, a really important one. So water flows here from the Yilgarn, from the Perth Hills, through the most ancient of dunes, the Mungit and the Banksia sands, through the rivers themselves, down to the limestone coasts, the edges of the ridges along the coastlines of Perth. And there it drives a whole series of tuat forests along the edge where the nutrients are high enough to create these giant tuat trees of the coastal plain. But I have become fascinated with maps, probably too obsessed with maps in terms of how they can speak to us, how they can teach us, and how they can tell so many stories. There is so much in a critical way as well that can be understood through mapping and remapping and ground truthing and using mapping as a tool for seeing and re-seeing. And this was a project that started to map out through Noongar stories and many, many, many maps of geology and other factors, these historic wetlands of the Perth CBD that have sadly almost entirely now been filled in. But there are these memories and these images and these places where restoration and actions for water are taking place. So yeah, to come here to this idea of the metropolitan landscape framework, I think this is part of the development here and part of the ongoing research project to think about how we can take systems that are surface systems and systems that are deep systems and start to transcribe and translate these into a planning context where they can start to challenge orthodoxies. So start with the deep. Aquifers surrounding the Belia. And this is a wonderful project I collaborated with Sandra Harbin on in 2021 for the Fremantle Biennale. But it was looking at groundwater and aquifers and these deep wetlands as a way of arriving at a Noongar story. And it's hard to sort of explain it, but you entered a large colonial space and there were perforations in the ground, these sort of access paths to the undercroft of this space, and lights and stories and water and Noongar language was sort of spread throughout the space so that you immerse yourself in this landscape. But Sandra Harbin shares these words, which in English translate to, "Where is your path? Our path is the water path. Walk slowly and softly when going along, and here the water will sit forever." So Sandra's a great collaborator here at UWA at the School of Design, and we often get her to come and talk to students. And she always says this. She says, "Dubakan Kuli, walk slowly and walk softly." And I think it's a really important lesson, particularly in a landscape as ancient and fragile as Perth's is. So these are some of the words that formed these different portals to the deep waters that were sort of transcribed into this space, but became part of this much larger landscape that you go out to and uncover all around the edges and the mouth of the Belia, where the Swan River meets the ocean, Fremantle. So from a sort of really interesting perspective, this kind of mapping started to inform a whole series of other layers over the city. And Perth has a very stratified series of geologies that extend from the hills all the way down to the coast. the work I've done in other cities reveals these incredibly complex geological maps, but Perth's is just so conveniently layered and simple in terms of being a series of ocean sands lapping over a very ancient rock and the edges of that rock weathering away. It's a very interesting and incredible landscape from a point of view of biodiversity for that reason. But working with Sandra was an opportunity to start to give these 6 ecologies Noongar names. From the coast, the Jundal, the white rock, the limestone, to the Kipalong, the wet sandy water paths through the landscape. The Mungit, these ancient sands which drive the Banksia woodlands and some of these really ancient ecologies. To the Mon, the Black Cays, the Bilia, the river systems, and the head, the Cardamunda, the rocky outcrop at the edge of the city. And interestingly, from a conservation perspective and from an ecological perspective, these systems each drive threatened ecological communities that also run straight through the city. From the ridgelands at the hills on the right there, to the salt marshes which follow the rivers, to the clay pans at the east of the coastal plain, to the Banksia woodlands, the Chewett forests, and the microbial and coastal communities at the ocean. So when I sort of spoke about the ancient landscapes running through Perth, this is a bit of a sort of just an introduction into that incredible biodiversity that runs through the city and that we can connect with and do connect with. But, you know, we could connect with in new ways as well, particularly through our urban development and planning. So these kinds of maps start to construct this framework, which we can then start to speak of as a deep framework. On the surface, there's a whole nother modified world, and the word modified, the word hybrid, kind of novel ecosystems, these landscapes are now heavily changed. There is an ancient structure that runs through this, but there's many, of course, non-native species. There's many ecological types that are really important that are non-native as well, like, for example, the pine plantations that are a critical species now for our threatened black cockatoos. But to look at how water has been transformed in this landscape and how tree canopy now forms the structure of this landscape has been the work of this surface framework. And to divide up the city between these different typologies. And the word remnant landscapes I'm using here just because it's sort of a common word, but I don't like the word remnant. It makes it sound, I mean, it does the right thing in conveying its scarcity and conveying that it is but I think perhaps ancient landscape might be a better word for these incredible ecologies that run through the city. The urban tree canopy, the novel ecosystems, transformed landscapes, weedscapes, others, and the hydrological structure of the city. So if we just look at one section of the Belia wetland chain, we have a hydrological structure, a whole series of novel ecosystems that frame the region, the remnant landscapes, the ancient landscapes, and then the urban canopy. Together, they make up sort of blue-green infrastructure. It's searching for a word to try and transform, as many of us are, try and talk to nature and trying to bring nature into planning. And blue-green infrastructure has been one that's becoming popular perhaps, or maybe is popular. But if we look now at the planning map, it renders the landscape as a whole series of green islands, and you can imagine everything in between is ocean. So it's a very different way of seeing these matrices of green become very different ways of seeing the landscape. So sort of fast forwarding here through the surface structure and the deep structure of these planning frameworks. And what's been really interesting for me from a practice perspective is trying to apply these at project scales and trying to say, okay, if we can start to utilize these and employ these and talk about these resonances when we work on projects, what kinds of new opportunities emerge, both for planning, but also for landscape architecture, for architecture and design. So we looked at this map before, 2,052 species in the Perth region. And if we zoom into this tiny wetland corridor, relatively tiny compared to a map of the whole city. There's 857 species within this corridor. And if we just look at an aerial image here, sorry, there's a siren going past me here. That's a bit noisy. If we just look at an aerial image here, I mean, Perth sort of has struggled with this. The fact that from a conservation perspective, the forests of the southwest, once we leave the city and enter these magnificent forests, they're very easy to put on a postcard and campaign for from a conservation perspective. But Perth's landscapes, where these 857 species might exist, they're kind of they're harder to campaign for because aesthetically they're less appealing to a mass audience than perhaps our forests. And I think this is an interesting one to bring up in relation to Sydney as well, because I think a lot of Sydney's landscape and a long movement from a European perspective of preservation around Sydney was owing to its incredible aesthetic quality. In Perth, it's sort of the opposite. There's sort of an anti-aesthetic around wetlands, which has persisted through a lot of the colonial mentalities. And so you come to a landscape like this, and in working with Noongars and working with the kind of maps around this, there's also got to be an ethos of reformulating it in some way to kind of re-see it and to campaign for it in these new ways. So we sort of turn on the deep map, looking at that landscape of the Ulbrook corridor. You turn on the deep map and you see it just comes alive with the threatened ecological communities, all the water flows that run from the hills, from the Cardamonda through to the Belia. This is a bridge of an incredible diversity across all of these geological and ecological systems. So the kind of counter mapping involved here of reconstructing other ecological, other cultural realities is a really interesting one for the city. But these are those systems that connecting the hills through this greater sort of core of biodiversity, following the Ulbrook down to the Jalgaroo, down to the Canning River. And if we look here, there's a major planning intervention happening around this corridor, which is the purple zone, which is an industrial development. So with the Belia group of scientists and professors who were formed around the Row 8 and Row 9 disputes through the Belia wetlands, the plan for a major highway through the Belia wetlands, which was thankfully stopped and canned. With the Belia group of scientists and professors, we have been putting together this vision for a regional park to kind of try and preserve and imagine this landscape in a future conservation zone, and not kind of exclude the industrial and the housing development altogether, but to push it across and allow for buffers. So these developments around the wetland are very real and are very, very violent, and have been drawn up many, many years ago before many understandings of biodiversity and the importance of this corridor were alive. And this hydroplane running through here, the kind of notion of very shallow groundwater, all the water that falls on this permeable landscape flows through. And so many of these species are groundwater dependent. They will have tap roots that enter the ground and might move down 5 meters. And that's the depth of the water table. But any further, and that when that water dries up or when that water table declines, those species then can't survive. So the interrelationship here between water and the threatened ecologies of this corridor it's really, really, really fragile. So a future Ulbrook Regional Park with really strong buffer zones has been the campaign of the Belia group. But, if we kind of look at this and think of it as the problem, which is the boundaries, the hard lines, the objectification, the resistance here has been to create a gradient, and has been to think of this buffer zone not as another series of lines in the landscape, but to resist that planning method and to think of it as a gradient from the very high fidelity through restored, through all kinds of recreation and open space zones that can be used by people and all the future people that are going into the housing developments around this wetland to the edges of the city. So the buffer here becomes a whole series of different ecological types that can exist within it. And if you don't have that buffer zone, you just get the high fidelity. You get that image I showed earlier where the development sits against that incredibly fragile landscape and creates a friction. So this is the plan for a regional park. And, there's different scales here of design thinking. You kind of move from a really big metropolitan scale into sort of more a precinct planning scale like this, which is really a campaign for a planning framework and a new series of conservation zones around the wetland. And then you move into a design scale. So you come to this area where there's a train station, you're 15 minutes from the city. This is the Greater Brixton Street Wetlands, and it's the suburb of Kenwick, for those that know Perth. And a whole series of old houses there on massive lots with potential old rural zonings over them and rural kind of land uses, maybe growing flowers or other small market gardens. And the sort of changes that then we need to imagine in here, where you could have many hundreds of dwellings with this upzoning. But how do those hundreds of dwellings exist with a buffer zone? And how can you get a good outcome for nature while also having housing? And that's sort of been the design provocation and the challenge here in terms of drawing it out. The high fidelity ecosystem, and this is creating the gradient at a more detailed scale, a restored landscape in that buffer zone, existing trees, new tree belts, spaces for water because we're very high water table and on clay pans, the landscape functions that might exist through this zone, and then an active street realm, and finally a series of well-established and good quality architectural medium density typologies that can exist within this greater gradient landscape framework. Another similar project in Ashfield, where we brought together new housing and urban greening, and an incredible suburb in the salt marshes and the Ashfield Flats alongside the Bilia. Here again, there was a huge upzoning imperative over this landscape. So what is 1950s houses had a whole plan for density. And in Perth, that density has meant battle axes and blocks get subdivided, existing tree canopy disappears, and you might get 4 houses where you had one 1950s house with a big backyard. And the critical importance here are the Ashfield Flats. Here we're about 15 minutes from the city as well by train. The critical importance here are the Ashfield Flats as a threatened ecological community of salt marsh alongside the Swan River. So yeah, you bring up the deep maps and you start to see a whole different series of systems at work that you might not see on the surface. The freshwater flows from those backyards in the suburb to feed the salt marsh and to feed the waters and the fresh waters in that salt marsh. So the importance then of, if there's going to be upzoning in this area, what is that going to do to the water? What is that going to do to the flows of water from the sky to the ground? This was a really interesting project at the School of Design where we asked lots of architecture teams to develop propositions for medium density housing alongside this landscape framework. And we imposed all sorts of restrictions. We said, you can't knock down any trees. You need to achieve a certain density and you need to achieve a certain permeability and openness to the ground. The design teams really interestingly worked with developers because we wanted to show how this stuff pays off and how it can be useful from an urban development point of view. Often the resistance to this is, of course, economic. The resistance to nature positive ways of doing housing is economic. So to bring in the financial voices was really important in this project. And myself and Rosie Howsmith and Lauren Holmes, 2 fantastic landscape architects based in Perth, were the landscape coordination team. So we really just got to tell the teams of architects and developers what to do. And we got some really fantastic outcomes, a whole series of briefings around the frameworks, and then a really interesting outcome of not upzoning by blanket, but actually sprinkling density through an upgraded street realm, which is what density needs. You're bringing in more people, you need a stronger landscape. And you need to reinforce those civic landscape connections from the river to the rail which was the outcome of this project. Yeah, so some really interesting architectural outcomes that I don't have time to go into, but yeah, interesting project. So that kind of scheme, that single corridor from river to rail, 182 dwellings. And we kind of figured you could do about 3 or 4 more through the suburb, and you could kind of achieve 910 dwellings. Now, this was important because this kind of upzoning, which is commonplace and is design regulation in Perth is preventing the worst of this development, but it's still pretty common, where you take one tiny house and you turn it into 3 or 4 or 5 without any open space, without any true canopy, only on the street, would yield 1,020 dwellings. So we're trying to get to that number while also saying it can be nature positive. It can connect people and place and birds and all the other things that we know and love trees for. So this is one scheme, one team scheme here with the incredible existing tree in the front yard there on the private property. Yeah, one final project I just wanted to quickly zoom through is all based around this incredible species, the Banksia menziesii, and this is a drawing from Philippa Nikolinski's book about the firewood Banksia. And we encountered these Banksias on a beautiful project site at Murdoch University, and Kingsley Dixon, the local botanist, was on our team and just gave us a whole botanical journey through fossilized Banksias and one of the most ancient species on the coastal plain and in the southwest. And these 3 systems we saw before at the city scale, the kind of Chewett on the Joondal, the Banksia on the old sands, the wetland systems. We found these at this university. The Banksia run right through the centre of the university through Banksia woodlands, which connect up to the dry lands around the wetland chains. There's a whole low-lying wetland system and lower area running through the edge of the campus, where a lot of the kind of horses and the veterinary school is currently based. And then up on the high ground, a whole Chewett landscape as well. So we find the systems of the big scale again at the kind of precinct campus scale, and then moving into our site scale, the sort of landscape briefing became really important for this team in terms of setting the brief for the architecture and the environmental response. And this was an environmental education centre. So it was important that it connected to all these landscapes around. So some of the collaborators on this were Melbourne architects NNBW and Baracko and Wright, and Perth architects Officer Woods. And it was just this really COVID era wide collaboration of many, many people during 2020, which was one of the fantastic projects I've had an opportunity to work on. And just picking up the site scale here, finding a drainage channel at the edge of the campus running south, turning that into a restoration wetland and an infiltration wetland. These critical Banksia groves to the west of the site here, and the kind of dunal systems running through. And just developing this as a landscape approach before it is an architectural approach. And the architects working on this project were just really, really wonderful in terms of not pushing any particular design agendas until really fragile ideas about this landscape were understood. And the architectural outcomes, I think, are fantastic. It's a whole mesh structure which exists over this fragile landscape. So, no sand pads here, no big concrete slabs, a very lightweight engineered timber and steel structure floating above this landscape, and one that's very appropriate for an environmental education centre. The idea that this might radiate out and become an instrument for future actions and repair across the campus in the future. These obligatory projects, you do these renders, and sometimes you get renders to be, they're often done by people perhaps outside the design team. And this was an interesting one because the Banksias came back as almost the same size as the people, sort of torso-sized Banksias, which we thought was funny. But we developed the renders and then had this amazing kind of view here, looking out over the Belia wetlands in the distance, through the old fragmented pine trees that exist through the Murdoch campus, and these other water systems existing with a different form of architecture. I wanted to just talk about this tiny scale now. And, sometimes working on these larger scales, it's frustrating because you're constantly advocating for a bigger picture and you're fighting against many embedded systems, as many of you know. And So finding a collaborator like Liam Moritz here, together we sort of started writing articles for Landscape Australia and started thinking, yeah, we can do stuff here. We can get plants in the ground. It's one of our mottos. Thinking about the biodiversity of the region, doing these larger scale mappings, and then arriving at site scales, saying, how do we get plants in the ground here? Arriving at another site scale, and how do we get it over there? So it's sometimes an antidote, I think, to thinking at actions for this huge scale, is to think at a really small scale and work at a small scale. There was a really interesting project for a design competition for aged care that we entered in and won last year, which meant that we had to start talking about what we were doing. We couldn't hide away and just do projects undercover anymore. So we sort of decided to brand it as Supernatural. And this is a garden we did in the north of Perth with many of the local species, some of which were, propagated in the backyards a few years before, and the kind of opportunity in the Southwest to use the biodiversity we have rather than the 80 generic species you can buy in many nurseries, to propagate and think about that number of more than 2,000 and how those species become part of our city is really interesting. And a big win for this project was seeing the cockatoos come back. And if cockatoos are feeding in the front garden and drinking from the trough, and that to us is a win. And I just wanted to return to that initial those words from Rod Simpson: resistance is fertile. And I don't know if Rod's still teaching or he's got anything to do with the University of Sydney anymore. But just wanted to bring that back to a person in Sydney, and also to a very beautiful idea, and finish up there. And please ask any questions, and happy to answer them.
Thank you, Daniel. I think your deep connection and your love for the place you live is really inspiring. And you've given us so much to think about, particularly around ancient landscapes and systems thinking, and the interaction between mapping and counter mapping, and the kind of work that can be done on both small and large scales around design ecology, centered around care, and also resisting some of the dominant paradigms that currently exist. Does anyone have any questions that they'd like to pop into the chat for Daniel? I know that we're close to being out of time, but we can extend the session if anyone does have questions. Maybe while people are thinking about it, I do have a question for you, Daniel, which is around the kind of interdisciplinary approach that you've developed. I'm really interested to know, how you kind of stretched out of working in a single discipline, and whether you encountered challenges in kind of, crossing different sectors, and being able to kind of bring disciplines together to imagine a different types of seeing and a future thinking.
And that's a really, I love it, working in an interdisciplinary way. I think it's really it produces really strong results and produces really strong synergies. And for designers, I think we often find ourselves working with other designers. Landscape architects often find themselves working with other landscape architects, architects with architects, et cetera, et cetera. And the minute you break away from that, you almost like have so much to offer, because other disciplines then encounter design and for example, the potential to communicate and map something. I'm thinking now of scientists, and you've got this great emergence where you can offer perhaps your skills in they're quite simple in many respects, and suddenly you're working in a conservation movement, and you're kind of trying to connect with a bigger picture. And it's that, I think breaking disciplines is fantastic, because our skills then become amplified and magnified, and there's so much work to do.
Do you feel like there's still a lot of kind of structural barriers to that type of cross-disciplinary approach?
Definitely. So I find collaborations with scientists have been really effortless. there's still work to do in collaborating with planners and trying to match up these ideas. Like I said earlier, to bring a concept like wonder across to a concept like urban planning, there's a whole challenge of translation there. And I think, yeah, we've got to change the way we're teaching disciplines like that in many ways, particularly here in Perth, if we're going to start to change the mindsets of the industry and of those disciplines as they exist. Yeah.
That's a perfect segue in terms of the interaction with the industry from Jacinda, who's asked, she said she's interested to hear if the attitudes of developers have changed or didn't change after some of the design projects that you've worked on.
Yeah, it was really good to work with the developers and interestingly, like it's for some of those developers, it was like a perplexing kind of initially a perplexing idea to be putting all these restrictions on the developments. Like you have to maintain every tree, you have to get X amount of open space on the lot, the importance of water and aquifers to a wetland that sits over there that might not have been a consideration within that lot boundary. But I think it started to change some perspectives. And what we realized was there's two things were really great synergies there. One was that the more lots you have, the more scale you have, the easier these things are to achieve. So we gave the teams kind of 5 or 6 lot groupings. And suddenly, rather than just working on one lot with maybe 10 dwellings, the developers were seeing the payoffs over larger scale. So bigger scale thinking can really work for our landscape, but it can also be a payoff in terms of an economy of scale for a developer. So sometimes there's things that work in opposite directions and they go in different directions, but this was one of those ones where there was definitely a synergy there between payoff and landscape payoff and financial payoff, which was cool.
There's another question here from Sally Farah, who says, thank you for your talk, Daniel. She's enjoyed your discussion of maps and deep maps and critiquing them. Given the act of mapping is so much part of the colonial project, do you see a way to map in your own practice or in your own teaching that foregrounds country and First Nations knowledge rather than the kind of zoning mapping approach?
Yeah, this is a really big one. And yes, I mean, at the same time as doing the most atrocious things, maps also can be great acts of resistance. And it's kind of that dilemma that if you're in a space and instruments are being used, like maps are, to the extent that maps are very violent instruments, if you don't then produce counter maps, which are then the instruments of the opposite, you do use that same language. You definitely can fall into the trap of using that same all-seeing, above, language, but you can also create resistance to those. So the work with the forests in the Southwest and other projects have really shown me other ways of mapping. And also they're very limited. The minute you enter into conversations and you've got to have all these voices. But I'm interested in the way maps can bring up many voices, can bring up many conversations, can lead to new things that are way more pluralistic and way more engaged and involved. Yeah, it's a good question, and I'm constantly critiquing maps. I was recently up on Noongar Country doing a bit of mapping there, and also seeing the immense power of maps for Indigenous protected areas, for native title, for mob to hold their own rights and make those rights known in a very rational way is like a completely legitimate and fantastically powerful use of mapping. So yeah, maps are complex, and I love that maps are complex, and I love that maps cause debate, because I think it's important.
For those who don't know of your work in the Southwest and around the campaign around deforestation and logging, stopping old growth logging, could you just talk a little bit about the role that maps played and your role in some of that work?
Yeah, that was a case of sort of like map activism, I guess, working with people on the ground who really knew the forests, but so much of the logging project and the mining project through the Southwest Forest is driven by environmental approvals that are grounded in maps. And the minute you can map what they don't want you to map, you've got a whole nother argument and a whole nother power that emerges. So yeah, they're interesting instruments for resistance, and I've definitely experienced that. But they're always lying. Maps are always lying. They show you one thing, maybe four things tops, and they exclude all the other things. And that's true of the violent maps, and that's true of the counter maps. They're always excluding a lot more than they're ever showing.
I think that the next question is relevant to ideas around exclusion, because so much Aboriginal cultural knowledge has been excluded from maps. And this question comes from Oli Ayeru. I hope I'm saying the name properly, but the question is, I'm wondering if any Indigenous people encountered your work and how they reacted to it.
Yeah, this is a good question. I mean, we entered into that Biennale project, and I thought it was going to all be about maps. And so it's like, oh, there's these amazing maps of wetlands and waterways and these deep waters, and yeah, like working with Auntie Sandra Harbin, it was like, yeah, that's interesting, and that's probably your white fellow way of thinking it's cool. But let's make this space all about voices, and let's bring in the Noongar language. Language is super important for her, and the whole project shifted to the point where the map was just some abstract way of arranging things in the space, and what you encountered in that project, Kepa Kaliakul, was the voices and the connections. So yeah, maps. Yeah, there's different approaches that go well beyond mapping too. Mm.
There's no other questions in the chat. Kate, did you want to close the session?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you both. That was phenomenal. Daniel, your work in the show, I think, really stands out, and it's great. It holds its corner and fights its corner fabulously. So for those who haven't seen the show, it's on at the Tin Sheds until the 25th of July. And I think it's brought out the amount of depth. So thank you for you put up your handles too, but I think it's worth, I just followed you online, and to see where this project, where you've all this work you've referred to, and also where it's going. I think it's inspiring. It's not just drawing attention to the issues, it's kind of finding a way forward, which is exactly what we need right now. So thank you, Daniel, and thank you, Sharmila, for putting it together. And for those of you who are watching, there's more of these talks. They start up again on the 14th of July, and they're pretty much every day, sort of until the end of the show goes on. They're online, so wherever you are, you can link in and do it. I would encourage you to hear it, because I think they just kind of give us so much food for thought and are really inspiring, because we need to re-see and rethink how we think about, map the future. So thank you both so much, and look forward to thank you for the hope you've given us and ways to sort of remap, rethink what we do. So big thank you from everybody on behalf of the audience here for your time, energy, and inspiration. And thanks for attending, everyone.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you for having me, and Sharmila for curating the exhibition. I think it's wonderful to bring people together from different geographies and places who are thinking in such careful and coordinated ways. I love it.